welcome everybody to our DPA Down Payment Assistance Best Practices gathering. Today's topic is HUD-Approved Nonprofit Roster. My name is Julie Guggen. I'm the President and CEO of the Minnesota Home Ownership Center. Brooke Walker is usually your leader here, and she's out of the office today. So myself and Laura Grievous are going to be facilitating this session, joined by all of you and our colleagues, Siri Giles and Sandra Reese as well. So thanks for taking the time to be with us today. We'll touch briefly, as we do during most meetings, on benefits of the DPA best practices. And then I'll turn it over to our colleagues, Jason Peterson and Lisa Ekstrom, to talk a little bit more about the HUD-approved nonprofit roster. Anticipate that we'll have ample time for questions and discussion at the end, but please feel free to use the chat function as we're going through here if you have questions that you want to make sure are noted. I'll remind everybody that this is being recorded, and we will post the recording fairly soon after this event. So let's talk a little bit more about the benefits of the DPA best practices. Laura, you want to advance us to the next slide?
Sure. Nope. There we go.
I think we've talked about this before. I think as we've been working collectively over the last couple of years around establishing best practices for down payment assistance, what's been top of mind is ensuring standardization and transparency, not just for clients, but for their trusted advisors, including homeownership advisors, real estate professionals, and lenders. It's part of our premise that existing down payment practices, without having a standardized set of best practices in place, existing down payment deployment actually creates barriers that limit consumer access to the funding that they need to secure homeownership. We also think that by providing best practices, those of you who do offer down payment assistance will strengthen your credibility as a provider and improve your ability to secure funds to create down payment assistance programs that are accessible and meaningful to consumers. We think this emphasis on accessibility and standardization and proliferation of standardized programs will help reduce the racial homeownership gap in Minnesota, which is fundamental to almost everything that the Homeownership Center does. And then, as is evidenced by the number of people on this call today and on previous calls, we hope to build a coalition among all of you who care about this work. So that's how we characterize the benefits of down payment assistance best practices. Next slide. So today's presenters are Jason Peterson, who is the CEO of NeighborWorks Home Partners. Jason has been working very closely with many of us for many years on this very topic, and in fact has been a very strong advocate for down payment assistance funding and policy work at the state legislature. And then after Jason, we'll hear from Lisa Ekstrom, who's the community product manager at US Bank, and who has been particularly vocal and supportive of efforts to address the racial home ownership gap. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason. Thanks, Jason.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julie, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, on this beautiful fall day. As Julie mentioned, my name is Jason Peterson. I am the CEO of NeighborWorks Home Partners. We are a Twin Cities-based nonprofit and NeighborWorks America Home Ownership Center. We provide community lending, home ownership counseling, and single-family development activity. Over the last several years, we have been the primary down payment, nonprofit down payment provider. So get to talk to you today about the really exciting topic of the HUD roster for nonprofit, and walk through some specifics around that. So this is pretty detailed, but as Julie mentioned, we will have ample time for questions. So if folks have any questions, please feel free to bring them forward. So just want to start with some basics. So what is it? What are we talking about today? So HUD provides 3 areas of programs in which they approve both nonprofits and government entities. And so those 3 are listed on the slide here. Today, we are going to be focusing on number 3, which is secondary financing. So secondary financing also means down payment assistance. So you can go to the next slide. All right, so entities requiring HUD approval for secondary financing. So there's a number of rules around who can provide down payment assistance with FHA loans and whether those funds can be used for the minimum required investment, i.e., the 3.5% down. So we're going to talk about, those are actually separate things. We're going to talk about both those today, but at a very high level, if a nonprofit or government entity is going to be providing secondary financing, i.e. down payment assistance with any FHA loan, what we're talking about today is going to be applicable. So as the slide notes, entities that require approval by HUD, so HUD needs to approve the entity, are going to be nonprofits. So those are going to be 501c3 nonprofits with at least 2 years of existence, or nonprofit instrumentalities of government. So both of these need HUD approval to provide secondary financing for FHA loans. Next slide, please. Conversely, there are entities that do not need HUD approval to provide secondary financing. So those are listed here. So what I do just want to highlight is that first one, government entities. So government entities, and then related to that, instrumentalities of government do not need HUD approval to provide secondary financing, i.e. down payment assistance with FHA loans. Next slide, please.
Yep.
So why is this important? So as I mentioned, so borrowers are not allowed to utilize down payment funds from nonprofits for FHA purchase transactions unless that nonprofit is approved by HUD. So that's a big deal. So if you think about folks getting down payment assistance for FHA transactions, if they're getting that down payment assistance from a nonprofit, that nonprofit needs to be approved. And so as you can see by this slide here, the entity must be approved prior to the second financing on any FHA loans. And that means they must be approved and on the HUD roster. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's not just the entity itself that needs to be approved, but that specific program. So for example, we have about 9 different down payment programs, and each of those 9 programs needed to be approved by HUD to provide that service. And so HUD will not only look at the entity, but also look at the individual programs, and that must occur before the transaction occurs. Next slide, please. So I do want to just separate out the minimum required investment piece, because I think these two can be confusing when talking about them at the same time. So what we've been talking about right now is down payment assistance. And so that down payment assistance may or may not be related to the minimum required investment. So as many of you likely know, HUD does require a minimum required investment of 3.5% for any FHA loans. So again, you can have this down payment piece that may or may not count for that MRI. So what I want to talk about here and laid out in this slide are when that down payment can count towards that minimum required investment. So if the funds are provided by a governmental entity, an instrumentality of government, or a Section 115 entity. So if you think back to a couple of slides ago, those are the entities that do not need HUD approval. So if the down payment comes from one of those entities, that can count towards the minimum required investment, that can count towards the 3.5 down. So conversely, if funds are provided by a nonprofit and name the government entity as the mortgagee. So for example, our organization administers the Minneapolis Home Program. So the Minneapolis Home Down Payment Assistance Program, we provide and administer those programs, but the city of Minneapolis is named as the mortgagee. So those funds count towards the 3.5%. And then finally, if a nonprofit is listed on the HUD-approved roster and the loans are assigned to a government entity, that will also count for the minimum required investment. An example of that is we have some of our down payment programs, we utilize MHFA impact fund dollars. Those loans, those down payment loans are closed in our name. We are a HUD-approved counseling or a HUD-approved HUD lender, and we do assign those loans to Minnesota Housing. So those loans would also count towards the minimum required investment. So again, I want to differentiate. This is just talking about what counts towards the 3.5 down. What we're talking about today also is the broader, can nonprofits provide down payment? Next slide, please. So approval process. So I'm going to walk through this approval process here. I know that there's a mix of folks on this call, both lender partners, nonprofits, and also a number of government entities. And so I'm going to be talking about this from a nonprofit perspective, but I think it's important for folks to understand the basis of this and what is required for nonprofits to be able to provide this down payment assistance. So the first step, and we work really closely with HUD on this, is to connect with HUD. The number is right there on the slide. They will do an initial screening and provide guidance if you're a nonprofit or if you're a government entity looking to find out more about this. The way that HUD operates is they have different districts, and anybody that's located in Minnesota is going to be routed to the Denver Home Ownership Center. And so that's who you would talk to. And then if you do move forward, then you would complete and submit the application. And that's what we'll walk through next. Next slide, please. All right, so there are 18 sections of the application. I'm just going to briefly touch on these and walk through what each one of these means. So here's going to be the first 6. So number 1, for a nonprofit to be approved as a down payment provider, they need to be a nonprofit. So they need to provide proof of tax exempt status. Second, and this was a big piece for us. We just received our down payment approval about 7 years ago. And this was a big piece for us. So the second one is board of directors and employees. What HUD looks at is they need information on all of your board members and all of your employees, and they do background checks. And so they will require social security numbers and some basic information for not only all of your staff, but all of your board members. They're primarily looking for conflicts of interest and any unpaid federal dollars. But this was a piece, especially with our board, that you need to have the conversation. And then every time that we recertify, they require this information. The third one is around principal management and staff members. So they require generally resumes, and they're looking for nonprofits to be able to demonstrate that they have the experience administering programs. Number 4, relevant experience is similar to that, except for they're looking at it at the organizational level. So they want to make sure you have the organizational systems in place. Think loan origination systems, think accounting systems, and the different technical infrastructures you need. Number 5 is pretty straightforward. They're looking to see who has signature authority, and within a nonprofit, that's going to be driven by generally a board resolution. Number 6, pretty self-explanatory. They want to see the articles of incorporation for the nonprofit. Next slide, please. So these are the next 6 here. The first being the quality control plan. So this is an important piece, and HUD has very thorough guidance on what they want to see in the quality control plan. And that's going to include both internal and external quality control objectives and activities, including auditing, monitoring, and the procedures around how you're ensuring that not only are you in line with the HUD requirements, but also with other state and federal lending regulations. The next one is being administrative capacity. So this is the ability to demonstrate the capability to develop and carry out home ownership programs in a reasonable time frame in a successful manner. So HUD wants to see that you are an organization that is able to carry out these programs. The next one is financial capacity. So HUD here is looking at your cash balances, your balance sheets, your annual expenses, your cash flow, and they will look back at your last 3 years of your audits, and they're going to want to look at your current financials as well. So the next couple here relate to your partners, and who has control over the organization. One of the pieces that's really important to HUD is there are not conflicts of interest when a nonprofit is providing the down payment assistance. So for other business partners, HUD's looking at written requires the nonprofits to identify business partners and demonstrate that the nonprofit maintains control over its home ownership programs and is not reliant upon business partners to operate the programs. So HUD is really making sure that the nonprofit itself is the one that's providing these programs. For consultant services, again, this is related to conflicts of interest. For HUD, this operations must be independent of the influence, control, or direction of a consultant or other outside party, particularly those seeking to derive profit or gain from a project or sale. Consultant services must be provided an arm's length basis and shall not constitute more than half of the nonprofit's activities. And so they're really, again, looking to try to ensure there's no conflicts of interest between how the nonprofit is administering these funds and any financial gain. And then the last one here is acting on behalf certification. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. It relates to the same piece. No one else controls the decisions of the nonprofit but the nonprofit. Next slide, please. So this is the last 6. So they do require that you submit any previous FHA approval letters. Adequate facilities. So offices must be located within a 200-mile radius of the geographical area in which you plan to serve. So our organization right now is approved for the Twin Cities metro area. So we can serve and provide programs anywhere within 200 miles of our office under our current approval. Later this year, we'll be launching, hopefully, or early next year, some programs that are going to go beyond that 200-mile radius. And so we are going to need to get some additional approvals, but the base approval is 200-mile radius from the geographic of the office. And then the nonprofits are required to have adequate office space, equipment, clerical assistants, and employees that can perform these duties. I know that one of our partners recently was approved by HUD as a down payment provider, and they had an office visit to check some of these things. And so we have not had in a couple of years, but we've also had HUD staff come out to look at our office for this. Lending partner information. So this goes back to conflicts of interest. They ask that you send in information for your lending partners. I mean, what they're looking at is no conflicts of interest exist. Employees of the lender cannot receive personal or financial benefit because of their business relationship. The application certification is fairly straightforward. It's you just signing saying everything is true and accurate. The next 2 are a heavier lift, though. So the first one is the Affordable Housing Program Plan, or the AHPP. So this is a written program plan that has to be submitted to HUD that shows that the nonprofit operates in a specific geographical area, and it offers homeownership opportunities to low to moderate income families for purchasing, rehabilitating, or reselling homes. And so this is a document. Our AHPP is about 20 pages long. We have to update this not only for our HUD down payment approval, but also we are a HUD approved counseling agency. So you can use that if you are currently a HUD approved counseling agency, but this is something that they want to be very detailed. And if you make changes to your programs, for example, when we started offering virtual programs when COVID came, we had to submit an updated AHPP out of cycle to ensure that we were in compliance. And then the last piece that they require copies of the legal instruments. So what that means is for each program, again, we operate 9 programs. We had to submit a copy of the mortgage, the note, and the guidelines for each individual program. And then they review those each separately. And then if they have any questions or clarifications, they will come back and talk with you about that. Next slide, please. All right, so application process. So once you talk to HUD and HUD says, yes, I think you'd be a great fit and you're interested in doing this, the first step is you submit application online via HUD's website. It's a super clunky website, as you likely could guess, because it's HUD, but it's how they use it. For example, you have to submit and upload each attachment individually. So we had 27 attachments for legal documents, and you upload each one individually. After review, they'll send it to your jurisdictional HUD home ownership center. Again, for us, this is Denver. And then a HUD rep's going to reach out to you for clarifications and questions. And I guarantee you, no matter how well you do, there's going to be some questions and clarifications, but they're great to work with. And then if you are approved, your approval is good for 2 years. If you are rejected for any reason, you have 90 days to appeal and resubmit. Next slide. All right, so I want to talk quickly about recertification. So like I mentioned, your approval is good for 2 years. If you have any changes during that time period, you do need to raise those, but if not, you have a 2-year approval. You then need to recertify prior to your expiration. And so you're required to have everything to HUD at least 90 days before your expiration. And they're very tight on this, and they really want to. They have really tight timelines, and they do not have flexibility on this. You need to, everything that I listed in that initial application, you need to submit again every 2 years. The additional piece that if you're recertifying is you also need to send them a list of all of the down payments, loans that you provided that were paired with FHA first mortgages over the last 2-year period. So for us, we had about just over 100 over our last 2-year period, and they pull 10% of those generally. So we then send in 10 files, and they review the files, they review income, they review the CDs, they make sure the minimum required investment is there. So that's an additional piece when you recertify. Next slide. So again, here's some of the ongoing compliance during that 2-year period. I'm not going to read these to folks. This is, directly from the HUD handbook. So everything kind of on here is what you would expect, but in general, you need to make sure you're in compliance with the rules. I will note that second box on the top from the left, there is no interim reporting due. If there are material changes, you need to let them know, but if there are no material changes over your 2-year period, you just need to ensure compliance, but you don't have a lot of communication with them. Next slide, please. So for more information, so I would suggest if you are really interested in learning about this in depth, you can check out the HUD Single Family Policy Handbook. But as I mentioned, and then there's a couple of websites on there that are pretty detailed, but as I mentioned at the start of this, the best place to start is just to give HUD a call. Our local rep in Denver is great to work with. He's been working with us now for a number of years, and I just worked with them to get some stuff approved a couple of weeks ago. And so he's really great to work with. I mentioned that we were having this webinar for some local supports, and he just encouraged folks to reach out. So if you're just thinking about this and or want to know more information, or your government entity wanting to learn more about this, give those folks a call. They're a great resource. So I think that is the end of my slides.
Any questions in the chat or anybody?
All right, turning it over to Lisa. Hi, Lisa.
Hello. Well, hi, everyone. If you have been on other of these quarterly calls, I spoke on the very first one, so you probably recognize me. But as Julie mentioned, I'm with US Bank, and I'm the community product manager there. So I review and approve and get all of these DPA programs approved for US Bank originators to be able to offer them. And before I get going, I just want to preface this by saying we are in the process of remodeling our bathroom, which my husband is doing right now. So if you hear any hammering or sawing in the background, I apologize in advance. The joys of working from home, right? So, Jason made my job pretty darn easy, because he covered a lot of things that I am going to touch on as well. I wasn't on camera, but I was shaking my head as he was speaking. So what do lenders require, or what do I look for? So when I review these down payment assistance programs to ensure that we can offer them, I review them and vet them against FHA guidelines, Fannie, Freddie, all of the different first mortgage product requirements. So we know what first mortgage programs we can tie these with. And for FHA, I do look, one of the very first things I look for when I get a down payment program that is through a nonprofit partner is I have it bookmarked as one of my favorite pages, the HUD-approved nonprofit roster. So I check that immediately. And the HUD approval letter, I look for a copy of that as well. And then Jason mentioned the legal documents. So what I expect from our loan officers who want to offer these programs and what I look for them to send to me is, again, that HUD approval letter and a copy of your legal documents, the note, the mortgage, and your parameters as well, or your program parameters or lender manual or whatever you may have. Because I do review those very carefully and ensure that they meet all of FHA's requirements before I, give the thumbs up and say we're able to tie these with an FHA program. And why we can't say yes to all the DPA programs. And this never falls short when I'm reviewing these, that this comes back to me if we, for whatever reason, have an unsaleable or uninsurable loan, because I'm approving these for the company and saying, yep, I vetted these against agency, FHA, what have you. And then if in the end we have an unsaleable or uninsurable loan because that wasn't an approved DPA or an approved provider, then that's really on us, because we have to keep that loan in our portfolio, and we can't deliver those and sell those and insure those loans. Again, I kind of put the same thing in both bullets, but we are responsible for insuring those, and we have to make sure that we do have that insurable loan in the end. And why we really want to approve, and I typically do look to approve any down payment assistance programs in conjunction with FHA, is because obviously FHA is a great first-time home buyer product, and we want to make as many choices available to our LMI first-time homebuyer borrowers as possible. And we definitely look to tie these with FHA as much as we can to just make that another tool for our loan officers to be able to offer those first-time homebuyers and LMI borrowers. So that's really high level what I look for when I'm reviewing these. I think that's the only slide I have. So any questions on that?
Great. Thanks a lot, Lisa. And thanks to both Lisa and Jason. So we'll open it up for discussion. Laura, we can probably stop the screen share. And so please feel free. I think you can unmute yourselves and ask your question directly or put it in the chat. I guess I'm new to this, so forgive me, but Jason, I'm curious about this DPA that may or may not be able to cover the MRI. Why? I mean, why are some not eligible and others are? And I'm just curious about that rationale. Why do you think that limitation exists?
Yeah, it's very nuanced, and as we've started to launch some different programs, we've been learning the nuances of this. And so I don't have a great answer on why the rationale is, but from what they've explained to me, HUD is very concerned about conflicts of interest and appearances of conflicts of interest. And so if a nonprofit is utilizing their own dollars and potentially profiting off of that, that is something that they don't want to have any appearance of. Where if it's on behalf of a government entity, and so those are where most of the carve-outs are, then that has that separation more so. And I will say one thing, I'll say related to that, and this is related to what Lisa mentioned as well. So as Lisa mentioned, the first mortgage provider is the one that's responsible for ensuring that the down payment assistance, that the MRI is coming from an eligible source. But as a nonprofit, when our files are reviewed, we are also required to be in compliance. And so in our last review, we did actually have a file out of compliance. And specifically it had to do with what Julie just raised. It was a government sourced funding, but it was not assigned over to the government entity. And so this is when we learned that piece. And so while the first mortgage provider is ultimately on the hook for that, it does fall to us. And we had to explain and provide in detail a plan so that does not occur again, or we would be removed from the HUD roster as well. So there are ramifications for the nonprofit provider for not following these specific pieces.
Henry Rucker pointed out in the chat that we probably need to do a better job of educating consumers and realtors about some of that nuance, and lenders as well, so that they aren't confused about really the dollar amounts that need to be brought to the table, right? In addition to whatever DPA they might be eligible for.
I completely agree. And a specific example that came up recently is, we're NeighborWorks on Partners. We are a nonprofit, but we're connected to NeighborWorks America, and they just had the Neighborhood Lift program. And so we got some funding from the Neighborhood Lift program. So we had a number of realtors and loan officers that assumed that that was government money and that could be used towards the minimum required investment. And so, we have folks like Lisa that understand the nuances, but there's a number of lenders that don't have a Lisa in house. And so Henry's exactly right. We had a lot of folks, and we had some folks that thought we were wrong and were angry with us, but helping folks understand what does and does not count for that. And I think that there are kind of the policy questions that you raised, Julie, but at the end of the day, that is what works and what doesn't. And so I completely agree with Henry that education for realtors and loan officers to understand that's really important, because sometimes you don't find that out until towards the end of the deal, and that is very problematic.
And while 3.5% doesn't seem like a lot, it's a lot of money, right? So if you're not prepared for that, yeah, definitely. So Lisa, I have a curiosity about programs that come across your desk for approval, and what are some common reasons they don't get approved?
Well, actually, the most common reasons are that we as the lender are responsible for fronting the funds, sending the funds to the closing table, and preparing the DPA note and mortgage, and the ramification is on us. So that's one of the first things. That's kind of a hard stop for us if we're responsible for doing that. We don't want to be, unless, of course, it's through an HFA. We have to, as we all know, because we deliver that first and second to the HFA at the end, and they purchase that from us. But if we're just tying, City of Minneapolis DPA with a standard standalone FHA, and we're responsible for fronting the funds and preparing the second mortgage docs, we tend to shy away from that. So I think that's the biggest sticking point. And obviously, if I see that they don't meet FHA requirements, but maybe meet Fannie Freddie, I would approve them for Fannie Freddie, but not FHA, or vice versa.
So you must see a lot of programs.
Do you see them for the entire nation?
you personally have national coverage, so
yeah,
how do you keep track of it all, and how are we all supposed to keep track of it all, right?
That's a great question, Jill. That's the $1 million question, and I don't do the best job sometimes. And here's one thing that trips me up quite often is, because I'm doing that for the entire country, and I have this huge spreadsheet. I probably shot myself in the foot, because back when we weren't, I've been at US Bank so long that we were First Star, and we weren't nationwide. So I had a more manageable amount of states, if you will, and I created this huge spreadsheet that has the maximum amount of assistance, the structure, underwriting requirements, all the whole gamut. Well, as we've grown, and I have 50 states now, I don't always have the time to scrub that and make sure the data that I have on it is updated. So unless or not, and I know Henry's probably shaking his head yes, because Henry used to be at US Bank as a CRA loan officer, so we worked together on this in the past. Unless our loan officers are out in the communities working with our nonprofit partners and know when they make updates to their programs, I'm not always getting that information and might have some outdated information on my spreadsheet, which is, you know, it's problematic, but that's a hard thing to get your arms around.
Henry suggests that we turn this conversation into a continuing education class for realtors. It's probably a good idea, right?
Yes, I love
We're
it.
all aware of this.
So, actually, I had a question, Jason, when you were just talking about not only is the lender on the hook, if you will, for getting the loan insured at the end, but so is the nonprofit partner. So, kind of going back to our last meeting we had about getting nonprofit partners on board for doing pre-approval letters, would that help the matter? Or, you know, doing, I don't know, and I'm not using the right term, pre-approval letters, but are you with me on that?
Yeah, I am.
Issuing commitments. That's it. I was losing
Yeah.
my train of thought.
So yeah, fund reservations on behalf of the down payment provider. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, so I don't necessarily think that those two will intersect. What we've imported within our process now is when we underwrite, we have a whole section where we're also similar. I assure you, all those yours is probably much more built out of U.S. Bank, where we are also calculating and checking that MRI, and so that's a piece that we didn't check as closely until we got flagged for doing it. And so really for us, because you know transactions can change, you know, throughout the transaction, and so ensuring for us, we check it, we recheck it again when we get that final CD right before closing too, and it's like, okay, so I think even if you had those fund reservations, I don't think that that's going to necessarily help
Sure.
the
That's not
nonprofit.
far
Yeah.
along down in the pipeline or the process.
Yeah, and our exposure is a bit different because, you know, as you mentioned, Lisa, for a first mortgage provider, that might make that not a saleable loan. So that's a much different situation. That's not the situation with the nonprofit. Our situation is we might get our approval pulled. And so, you know, both ramifications, but a bit different. And so for us, we
Absolutely.
can check it at the end. And we have had situations where situations have changed and folks thought that you know, X down payment would count towards that 3.5%, and it doesn't. And to Julie's point, I mean, 3.5% is only 3.5%, but it can be a lot. And we've had
Oh, for
deals
sure.
that people are scrambling at the end because they didn't. To head back to Henry's initial point on this, if folks don't understand some of these nuances and are, you know, and stuff changes, that's when we see a lot of the major issues. Because right on the front end, we can say, hey, this isn't going to work for the MRI, but when you start to get down to the, you know, closing table, you know, and 3 days before and stuff is changing and folks aren't catching that, that's when we always review it at the end. And we've had a few times where we've had to make some, you know, calls that weren't pleasant to try to figure out a solution.
Okay.
So, Jason, it's my understanding that there are a finite number of nonprofits who have the same designation that you have in Minnesota. Can you talk a little bit about that scope of services and perhaps the importance of expanding that number?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. Yeah, I believe so. As Lisa mentioned, there's a website, you can Google it and you'll find it. And you can actually search it's a HUD website, and you can search a database that shows all three of the programs I initially listed, but you can just search specifically for secondary financing. I believe right now there's only 8 nonprofit down payment assistance approved providers in the entire state. And so, you know, again, the importance, so you know, for folks that have been working in this industry for, you know, years and decades, the importance, the usage, the prevalence of usage of FHA loans ebbs and flows. But when there's higher usage of FHA loans, or especially when FHA is a very good product for the families that we're working with, it's really important to have a strong group network, and especially diverse network of nonprofit providers that are able to provide this down payment assistance. So, you know, again, for us, we can only operate right now within the 200 miles of our office in the Frogtown neighborhood of St. Paul. And so there's going to be lending activity that's going to fall outside of that. And that's going to limit, if you do not have an FHA down payment approved down payment assistance provider in that area, then you might not be able to pair those loans. And so that's really challenging. So I think the geographic, ensuring that there's the adequate geographic coverage, but also, these are nonprofits, and nonprofits are tied within communities. So ensuring there's a good, diverse representation of nonprofit lenders that have this approval, because if you do not have this approval as a nonprofit, you're not allowed to provide down payment assistance, whether or not it's that MRI or not. And so it's really critical. It's a somewhat time consuming, arduous application process, but I laid out today, and if folks have questions, it's relatively straightforward. But once you get through that and you just take the time every 2 years, then you're set, and then you can do that, and you can offer, you can give Lisa a call and confidently say, hey, we're on the roster, my down payment meets these. Because one of the pieces, so I know Lisa looks for this, but one of the important pieces when you get approved is they are looking at all my mortgages and notes. And so all the same things that Lisa's looking for is what HUD is looking for. And so if I have a review and HUD changes, so just this past year, they inserted a new paragraph that I had to put in every one of my mortgages and notes. But then they know that Lisa knows that I have accurate documents. And so it's not just that approval piece, but it's ensuring that you have what you need. So the first mortgage providers are comfortable with that. And as I started out with, I believe there's only 7 or 8 all across the state. So I would encourage nonprofits that are doing down payment or considering doing down payment to go through the process.
Thanks, Jason. So couple of questions in the chat. Megan is wondering if a DPA program is eligible to cover the MRI if it is assigned to a government entity, but the nonprofit receives a fee paid from the loan.
Yes. So the short answer would be yes. So a DPA program, so if the DPA program, so if the down payment is originated by a nonprofit, and the nonprofit is assigns a loan to a government entity, then that is fine. The fee portion of that is not an issue. And when you work with HUD, they want you to submit both your mortgage and your note and your guidelines that generally speak to fees. So if any fee issues would come up there, they would raise that, but that would not, just as a blanket statement, that would not be a problem.
And Jason, in general, can you just review what you shared about the MRI being met with government-funded DPA? So just clarifying that government entities, they can use their own funds to cover the MRI, correct?
That is correct.
And if you get government funds, like an impact fund program, if you get government funds and then assign that loan to the government entity, that can cover the MRI.
That's correct. And so there's really 3 different scenarios. So scenario 1 is funds are provided by the government entity. So that would be a situation when the government entity is the one that's originating the loan. So they don't need approval, that government entity or the instrumentality of government, and B, that can count towards the 3.5%. The next one is funds that are provided by a nonprofit, and the name of the government entity is the mortgagee. So again, the example I used was we originate on behalf of the city of Minneapolis. We do the origination, but the loan is closed in the name of the city of Minneapolis. And so that counts towards the 3.5%. Scenario 3 then is when the nonprofit is listed on the HUD-Approved list and the loans are assigned to a government entity. So that's the one you just mentioned, Julie, where an example would be impact fund, where we close the loan in our name. We are on the HUD-Approved list. Those then are assigned to Minnesota Housing. Those count towards the 3.5%. So if you're using impact fund, that counts towards the 3.5%.
So there's a question about a particular transaction that your organization had rejecting the Bloomington DPA, Wells Fargo rejecting the Bloomington DPA. And this is from Kathy Wetzel-Mestel. They also rejected Impact Fund DPA and Minneapolis Home DPA that PRG was trying to work on. So any insight into what's going on there with Wells Fargo?
I don't. So to clarify, they're not allowing those DPAs as approved DPAs for Wells Fargo, it sounds like, Kathy. I don't have any insight. I mean, to Lisa's earlier point, you have HUD rules around what does not count towards the 3.5%. But then you need to submit generally speaking, each lending institution then also has to approve. And so I don't have any insight as to why Wells would not approve those.
Yeah, it was interesting because I mean, they're all three of them are government funded DPA, and it was on we were working with Wells on the impact fund, our impact fund DPA, and they had an issue with layering impact with Minneapolis Homes, and so said no to that. And then I think we heard from Johnny the next day that Wells had also rejected the Bloomington DPA on one of your transactions. Maybe it's just Wells Fargo.
I think it's just Wells Fargo, because when we did Lyft, we were layering Minneapolis Home a lot. So I don't know if something changed or, I'm not saying anything about Wells, but you have folks that are sometimes more, not even risk adverse isn't the word because it's not a risk, but don't necessarily want to dig into some of these, and it's just sometimes easier to not dig into some of these. But they layered with Minneapolis Home in the past. So I think I'll reach out to Wells about this because I didn't know that about Bloomington either. But
Well,
there's
confirm the details with your staff before you do that. Yeah,
I will do that, but
okay.
There's nothing inherently that I talked about today that would make it so Wells couldn't use those programs, because we do the Bloomington program that's closed in Bloomington's name, that would count. We do that with a bunch of other lenders, and Minneapolis Home we do with a ton of other lenders, as with Impact. Nothing we talked about today would make Wells not be able to approve that.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
So Tressa has a question. As a PHA or HRA for several counties, is there a process that they would have to go through with HUD to provide DPA, or is it just on the lenders we work with to approve their program?
So I'm going to deflect this one and suggest that you call HUD, because I'm not a government entity. My understanding of the rules is that there is not a process that government entities need to go through. I believe it's just the nonprofit lenders, but then also, if you're working with US Bank, you would talk to Lisa. There are larger, I guess the size doesn't always matter, but generally speaking, the larger institutions have somebody like Lisa, which is great, but then they can also corporately approve programs. When we work with some smaller lenders, they don't generally corporately approve programs. So they'll, look, when we have a deal with them, they'll either not ask sometimes, or sometimes they will, each time we submit a down payment program, they'll ask for some information, which I think is frankly more challenging. I appreciate when Lisa and others are just like, okay, we got it in the database, this works. And so depending on where you're at in the counties and the lenders you're using, I would reach out to them and be proactive about it. But I would encourage you to just give HUD a call just to verify that, because again, I didn't put the disclaimer out. I'm not a HUD employee. I'm not verifying all of these pieces. I just know this from the nonprofit side. But my understanding of the rules is, as a government entity, you do not need that approval.
Lisa, anything Tressa should know as a government entity if they're going to be submitting information to you?
Nothing more than what I already covered, I think.
Great. All right. I have one last question. Does the structure of the program, grant versus loan, matter?
Are
So-
you,
You,
who are you
I guess
asking that
I
to?
guess I'm asking Jason.
the
Well,
answer,
maybe
Okay.
both of you, but Jason, so let's say you're administering grant programs. Do you have to be FHA approved to do that? Or
if
HUD
you're,
approved to do that?
if you're going to provide secondary financing, whether it's a grant or a loan, all of this is applicable. If and then the form of that does not impact whether or not it counts towards a 3.5%. So 3.5%, whether or not it's the form of a grant, the form of a loan, if it meets those criteria, will count towards that. And whether or not you're doing this and so again, this would be, anything that comes through the transaction. So this is going to be, forgivable. This is going to be anything that's going to be a forgivable type down payment assistance, due on sale, amortizing. You're going to need, as a nonprofit, you need that approval, even if you're just providing that grant.
Lisa, anything you'd add to that from your perspective?
No, other than grants are, obviously are much easier to approve because we don't have the legal documents we have to review. So on a selfish note, they're way easier for me to do, but
Yeah,
Great.
and to Lisa's point, that's a big piece of the review is going to be ensuring, and HUD has a number of requirements and what needs to be included in the mortgage and the note. And if it's
Mhm.
forgivable and it's a grant, then that makes that a lot easier.
Got it.
Right.
All
And
right.
that's a good point, Jason. One of the things I do look for when I'm reviewing the note and mortgage is that there is a clause in there that states that that lien goes away upon foreclosure of the first mortgage. So that's something I do look for.
And I see Kathy's question. So confirming the MRI can be met with government funded DPA. So yes, but so I'll give you an example of where it cannot be. So let's say that the state of Minnesota set aside or provide an appropriation of $100 million for a first generation down payment program, and those dollars are going to a nonprofit. And that nonprofit does not assign those loans over. They are government sourced, but they're not closed in the name of the government entity. They're not assigned back to the state of Minnesota. Those funds cannot count towards the MRI. So it either has to be closed in the name of the government entity or assigned to the government entity to work for the MRI. So it's not just source of funds.
All right. Are there any final questions? Once again, Jason and Lisa, thank you very much. Laura's going to show us one last slide related to our November gathering. So we'll be meeting on Thursday, November 9th from 1 to 2:30. I believe registration is open. I presume that Brooke has either mailed out that link or we'll get that to you shortly. And the topic will be targeted eligibility and reducing the homeownership gap. So we'll hear from DPA providers who are using targeted eligibility to both special purpose credit programs and not, to reach buyers who have historically been left out of homeownership. So I think it'll be a great discussion. We'll hear some really innovative approaches to this work, and looking forward to that conversation. So unless there are any last questions, I want to thank everybody for being here and have a good rest of